There's a reason Ed Sheeran documents every single songwriting session, and it starts with a lawsuit. Hello, and welcome to Whose Song Is It Anyway? Hosted by me, creative industries legal expert, Dr. HAYLEIGH BOSHER. I'll be your guide to the big legal questions shaping the music and creative industries right now. Think of this as your weekly dose of all things copyright, ownership, and intellectual property. It actually started well over 10 years ago when Pharrell Williams and Robin Thicke got into the studio and were making a song that they wanted to sound like Got to Give It Up by Marvin Gaye, because that was one of their favourite artists and their favourite song. And they wanted to create the same kind of vibe for their song. What they didn't know at that point is that this would become one of the biggest, most controversial copyright infringement lawsuits in America, where the Marvin Gaye estate would be awarded the highest damages ever in this kind of case up to that point. And the reason that they didn't know that is because at that point, everybody thought that the boundaries between copying and taking inspiration in copyright meant that you could take inspiration from your favorite artist, and that a vibe is not something that copyright protects. But as you probably know, they went on to lose that case, and it turned out that it was an infringement in that circumstance. What many people don't know, though, is that the case was always about money and not about music. Sadly, when Marvin Gaye died, he actually left his family $60 million in debt. And so when the debtors came in to try to organise and salvage the estate, the court case was part of that strategy to monetize off of the copyright. So it was never about music. It was always about money. And the legacy that court case left was a decade, more than a decade, of similar types of cases. We call it a floodgates case because it opened the floodgates to lots of different other types of cases coming through. The Blurred Lines case meant that other people who had heard another song that sounded like their song were like, oh, that must be infringement too. But what we're going to talk about today in this episode is the real test for copyright infringement, and to understand the difference between taking inspiration and copying. So that Blurred Lines case happened in America, but we still felt the aftermath of it over in the UK. And that's where Ed Sheeran was sued by an artist and his team called Sami Switch. So Ed Sheeran was sued after the Marvin Gaye and Robin Thicke case happened. In May 2018, Ed's royalties from PRS were frozen. What you can do if you're suing someone and you're disputing over who owns the copyright in something, you can let PRS know and they will freeze the royalties until the dispute has been resolved to make sure that the money doesn't all get spent before the court case happens or the situation is resolved. So Ed's not getting paid any royalties for his song, Shape of You, which is a huge hit at the time. And there's back and forth between Ed's legal team and Sami Switch, that's his performer name, but his real name is Sam Chokri. There is something that happens before the court case. So they write to Ed Sheeran's legal team and say, we think this song, Shape of You, infringes Sam's song called Oh Why. But when things don't progress and they can't come to some kind of agreement, then actually what happens is Ed Sheeran's team file the lawsuit, which you probably all heard of this lawsuit, but that's probably not something that most people understand or make sense, because why would Ed bring the case when it's against him? But given all the back and forth, not moving forward, in the end, it was Ed Sheeran's team who decided, let's go to court and get this sorted. So they made a claim for a declaration that it wasn't infringement. So the case name's actually backwards than you would expect it to be. So when they get to court, there are a number of different hearings and phases to this case. It goes on for years and it costs millions of pounds. No one wants to go to court. No one wants to go to court. It's expensive. It's draining. It's emotionally draining, physically draining. Like it's the last resort. No one wants to be there. And what that means is, whatever you believe from this story and whatever message you take from it, Sami must have genuinely thought that there was something in the claim, because you wouldn't spend all that money and all that time on, in my view, if you didn't truly believe that. And equally on Ed Sheeran's side, whether you know the outcome of the case or not, we'll get to that. They obviously felt very strongly that it wasn't a copy and that they had to take a stand and say, no, this was independently created. So here's what each side argued. We'll go through that, and then I'm going to talk to you through the actual test for copyright infringement before we come to the outcome of the case. So on Sami's side, they argued that Shape of You was a copy of his song, Oh Why. And they produced a musicology report. So a musicologist is a musical expert, not a legal expert. And what they do is they look at the songs from a musical perspective and draw out the similarities or the differences in order to help the courts decide whether there has been an infringement or not. In Sami's musicology report, they drew out things like the lyrics. So in Shape of You, it says, oh, I, I'm in love with the shape of you. And then in Sami's song, it says, oh, why, oh, why, oh, why. And those two bits, if you listen to the clips, do sound really similar. So they also pinpointed a couple of other similarities that they believed were in both songs. So structure of the lyrics, tone, harmonic progression, texture, rhythmic clicking. So these were the things that they said were similar about the two songs. Ed Sheeran's side argued that the songs were significantly different, and then pointed out all the reasons why the songs were not the same, saying that the lyrical content is different, the mood and the key is different, the context of the songs are completely different, so they're about entirely different things. The lyrics are different, although it might sound similar. The words oh, I and oh, why, the Y and the I are different. So therefore, the only thing that's similar is the sound O, or the word O, in the lyrics. But then they went on to say, even if they are similar, the parts that are similar are not the copyright protectable parts. And so therefore, it can't be infringement. And on top of that, Ed Sheeran has never heard of Sami Switch before. He's never heard this song before, and therefore he couldn't have possibly copied it because he'd never heard it before. So these are the arguments that the two parties bring to trial when they finally get through the door of the court at the final court case. But before that, something really interesting happens, and it's a plot twist in the story, I think. What people tend to see when court cases are in the news is the final court case, the final hearing, and the outcome. But what actually happens behind the scenes before that is a ton of meetings, back and forth correspondence between the parties, and often several other hearings, which is the same as the final trial, as in like you go into the court and the judge will be there. Sometimes it's done over telephone, but you basically have these like mini court hearings that build up to the biggest one. And at that point, things can be decided, like what we'll argue about when we get to that final court case. Because cases are huge sometimes and they want to like narrow them down. In this case, there was a pre-hearing because Sami Switch's side wanted to bring a certain type of evidence into the final trial. And wasn't usual in this kind of case. So they had to have like a mini hearing about it where the judge would decide if they're allowed to bring that evidence. What the evidence was is something called similar fact evidence. And what that means is a pattern of behaviour. And what they wanted to show in their evidence of the final trial was that Ed had a pattern of behaviour of copying other people. So this wasn't just a one-off. He'd done it loads of times before, and therefore that would suggest that he's likely to have done it again. In this pre-trial hearing, Sami Switch's side revealed to the court that Ed had settled a number of other copyright claims, sometimes with a settlement agreement, and sometimes with a share of the royalties for the song. So, for example, Ed Sheeran wrote with other people, Strip That Down, that was later recorded by Liam Payne. And the credits and the royalties for that song are shared with the writers of another song called It Wasn't Me. And they received 25% of the PRS royalties, which is, I would say, pretty high. Like, if you had maybe negotiated that before a claim, it probably would have been lower. It always depends on the circumstances, but just relatively speaking, that's pretty high. There was also a royalty share of 15% of the PRS royalties given to the writers of No Scrubs, which was for the same song, Shape of You. And now remember this because it becomes important later on when we get to the outcome of the case. And finally, for Ed's song Photograph, he was sued by the writer of a song called Amazing, and they settled out of court, and then a 35% of the PRS royalties went to the writers of Amazing. So these are the examples that they were putting before the court, being like, look, he settles all the time, he must copy all the time, and this is what he does. He just asks for forgiveness, not permission. Ed's side at this hearing were like, absolutely not. None of these are court cases. So none of them say Ed was guilty of copyright infringement. There's loads of reasons why someone might settle out of court. Usually because they're a busy superstar and they just want the situation to go away. So they just pay the person to go away, even if they hadn't copied. However, the judge in this hearing decided in favour of Sami Switch and said, for the final trial, you're allowed to bring this evidence as part of the trial, which was a big blow for the Ed Sheeran side at the time. In particular, the judge had said, because the settlement percentages were so high, that it indicated a real chance that there had been copying, or at least there would be a high chance of a successful copyright claim. So the reason there was such a high PRS percentage, the court thought at that point, was because they were like, oh no, we did do it. Oops. We better pay them off so they don't sue us. So that's what they thought had happened. But wait, there's more. So before I tell you the outcome of the case and the reasoning, let's get some clarity on some of the key questions around copyright infringement. Can I get sued for making music that sounds like somebody else's? What's really important to remember here is copyright is not a monopoly right. And what that means is that if you and I are in separate rooms of the same house and we're like, okay, you go and write a love poem and I'll go and write a love poem. And we don't look at each other's, but then when we're finished and we swap, we're like, oh, they're exactly the same. Even if that was possible, even if that happened and they were exactly the same, there could be no copyright infringement because I'd never seen your poem before. And that counts for things that are maybe even more obvious, like if you and I go and stand at the top of a hill and we're looking at a beautiful landscape and we decide to paint the landscape, and we're sat next to each other, but we're not looking at each other's work. We're just looking at the landscape and we're painting. Now, the painting that I do is going to look so different than the painting that you do, mainly because I can't paint. But I've got different skills. I maybe have got different paints. I've got a different view and perspective on the world. So it's going to come out differently. But the idea, the concept of painting the landscape, that's not protectable. Anybody can do that. Our individual expressions of the landscape in our artwork that we've painted, that's something that can be copyright protected. But it's not a monopoly. So even if we stood side by side and we took a photograph so that they were almost exactly the same, but I never looked at yours, I never copied you, then I have copyright in my photograph and you have copyright in your photograph. I know a story of a wildlife or a nature photographer who had taken this epic picture of an iceberg. And he was, so in order to do that, you can imagine he was on a boat somewhere very, very cold. And some weeks later, he sees his picture of the iceberg on the front page of a well-known nature magazine. So he calls up the magazine and he's like, excuse me, you're infringing my copyright. You've taken my picture without my permission. this is a copyright infringement. And they turn around and say, actually, no, there was someone stood behind you who took the same picture and we licensed it from them. So this is a really good example to show you that copyright is not a monopoly. It's your own individual creation is protected and so is somebody else's. What it regulates is copying, not if two things look the same. If they are created independently, then there's no infringement. So a really good top tip is to keep a record of your creative process. Because if something happens, and I have had this with clients in real life situations where someone has come along and said, you copied this thing. So an example I had was in fashion, where a client had created a design and then later had seen that a big fashion house had produced a design that was incredibly similar, if not exactly the same. We write to the fashion house and say, we think this is a copy of our work. And they write back and say, here's the minutes from our meeting 3 years ago when we came up with this idea. So, and that's case closed. Because if they created their work before we created ours, then it can't have possibly been a copy because ours wasn't around them. So for you, what that means is if you keep a record of the creative process and not just the final finished thing, if it ever comes that someone says, hey, that's a copy of my thing, whether it's, a photograph or a movie or a song, and you've got a record to show that you actually created this before their song or their book or their photograph was created, then it's case closed and it goes no further because you can't have possibly copied it because you made your thing before. So ultimately, copying in copyright is about what has been copied. So what's the actual legal test for copyright infringement? So there's 3 stages to the test for if there's been copyright infringement or not. I'm going to give you the detailed breakdown of what that looks like under UK law. It is different in different countries around the world, although lots of them are fairly similar. So the US case I was talking about earlier with blurred lines, the way that the test is worded and the structure of it is slightly different, but actually the questions that we ask at the 3 stages of the test are the same. There are different elements to it that do change, and that's why we often see a lot more cases in America and maybe different outcomes than what we would see in the UK. So there is an impact there. However, this is a top level kind of overview of the test. And I think that it gives you, no matter where you are, it gives you a good idea of where the line is drawn. There isn't really a line. It's unfortunately not that simple. But if you're in a different jurisdiction to the UK and you want to know more about the test for copyright infringement, make sure you look up the specifics of what that looks like in your country as opposed to in the UK. This is the exact breakdown of the test. Okay, little caveat there. So the 3 things you need to test if there's been copyright infringement under UK law. 1, there has to be copyright in the thing that is being claimed to have been infringed. Because if it's not copyright protectable, so say, for example, it was created more than 70 years after the death of the creator and therefore the copyright has expired, there can't be a copyright infringement. The second part of the test is that there has to have been copying. Okay, so we know that copyright is the protection against copying. So it's pretty obvious that stage 2 of the test, once you've established that there is copyright, is that the copyright protected thing has been copied. Now, what's important to remember is that in order to copy something, you have to have had access to it. So you have to have seen the photograph before you copied it. You have to have seen the painting before you copied it. You have to have heard the song before you could have possibly copied it. So access is the first hurdle in the copyright test. If you have never heard the song before, you can't possibly have copied it. This is a really tricky part of the test, given that this law was written like 30 years ago when things like music weren't everywhere around you all of the time. Now we have so much easy access to music. How can you really say for sure if you've never heard this song? Because it might have been playing on the radio. It might have been on a streaming playlist that's just playing at you. It might be in a shop that you walked into. You may have heard it. It's a very tricky test, which I actually think needs to be adjusted slightly, given how much access we have to copyright protected materials now. I think the barrier should be higher. Under UK law, the barrier for access is actually quite low. If you have a video of someone listening to the song, then obviously 10 out of 10, that's ticked. And sometimes if the song that's claimed of being copied is super famous, #1 hit record, then often people are like, yes, I've heard it, obviously. There's no denial of hearing it. And then the case moves on to just discuss the third part of the test. But what's actually more typical is that if the song is lesser known, the artist being accused of copying has said, well, I never heard this song before. And that's really tricky because we can't really say for sure. And actually, in the Ed Sheeran trial, he was cross-examined by the barrister, who said to him, can you say for sure that you've never heard this song before? And Ed, quite cheekily but accurately, said, if I could prove that I'd never heard that song before, we wouldn't be here. And it's true, because if that was actually possible, then that would have been case closed. If you've never heard the song before, you can't have possibly copied it. There's no copyright infringement. Okay, so the third part of the test, which is the really interesting part for a copyright perspective, is that the parts that you have copied are what we call in the law substantial. So in law, often the words that we use don't mean the same thing that they mean in everyday language. So substantial in copyright doesn't mean a lot. It doesn't mean that you took loads of the song necessarily. It means that you took the protectable parts. So going back to my painting example from earlier, if I create a painting and you create a painting of the same scenery, but I use my own personality, my own skill, my own perspective on the world, and you do the same, our paintings are going to look different. In copyright, we call that the expression of the idea being the landscape that we're painting. And we also look at the originality of those two paintings. So originality, again, doesn't mean completely unique and original, like never been seen before, as it might do in everyday language. In law, in copyright law, originality means that you used your own creative expression, your own creative choices, your own skill and effort is the older legal terminology in the UK. But your own creative choices is the way that we describe that. And that's very lofty and confusing, I know. It doesn't necessarily give you a clear idea of what that would look like. It's decided on a case-by-case basis. But what's important to remember is that the first part of the test is that there is copyright in the thing being claimed to have been infringed. The second part of the test is that there has been copying. And in order to copy, there has to have been access. The third part of the test is that if there is copyright and there is copying, the parts that are copied are the original parts, meaning that there has been a substantial part taken. Because if you take the insubstantial parts or the unoriginal parts, then that's also not copyright infringement. So for example, in the painting situation, if I painted the field green and you painted the field green, those two parts of the paintings would be the same, but they would be considered insubstantial parts because they're not unique and original. They're not a creative choice. The field is just green. And we don't want to stop other people from painting green fields, right? Ultimately, what is the difference between inspiration and copying? This is a really tricky question because there is maybe on one end of the answer is like if I traced a drawing, that's copying. If I sample, if I cut and paste your song into my song, that's copying because I physically just copied the whole thing. Or if I upload a movie to the internet, that's copying if I haven't licensed it, right? So there's that direct whole copying of the whole part. Then on the other end, there's taking inspiration, where if I'm going to write a novel, I might read loads of different novels and take inspiration from different aspects of the different novels. But none of them have I directly copied from. None of them have I used the character or the plot or any of the specific language. That would be clear inspiration. So copying in terms of copyright infringement and substantial part, so taking of the substantial part, lies somewhere in between. Is there copyright? Has there been copying? And is that copying a substantial copying? And substantial relates to the original elements. So it's inspiration and it's not copying if you take from a song, for example, the standard blues chords, because they're in all the blues songs. So it would make no sense that we could only have one song with those chords. So you should be able to take that chord sequence and use it in another song. So in a song, if we are thinking about the fact that there are only 12 notes that you could possibly use, and often you're creating a song within a framework that often relates to the genre of the music that you're creating, those are limiting your choices of what you can do. And the originality, remember, relates to the creative choices that you do make. So where there's no creative choice, there's no copying. Where you're making an individual creative choice to do something slightly different, that's the originality part. And that copying that bit may be an infringement. Just me interrupting myself to let you know that if you're looking for a guide to navigating the world of copyright in music and the creative industries, you can pick up the new edition of my book, Copyright in the Music Industry. In it, I share everything you need to know about copyright, intellectual property, and more on navigating the world of AI. And I go into much further detail about the topics I've spoken about today. It's straightforward, digestible, and most importantly, will empower you to make the right moves to protect your own work. I'll leave the link in the episode description for you to pick up your copy. So, what happened at the Ed Sheeran trial was this. Although the songs did have similarities, the judge decided it was an infringement. And the reason was this. The judge went through meticulously all of the scenarios, situations, common people that Sami Switch's team had said were the ways in which Ed could have heard of his song, Oh Why. And the judge determined that none of these played out, and that actually he believed Ed Sheeran that he'd never heard this song before, and therefore he couldn't have possibly copied it. But for the avoidance of doubt, the judge also said that whilst the songs do sound similar, and he really kind of empathized with Sami on this and said, I get why you think that they sound the same, because they do sound the same. But the parts that are the same are parts that are not protected by copyright. So they're insubstantial parts. They are the unoriginal elements. And therefore, even if he had heard it, which we don't think he did, it still wouldn't have been infringement because you failed at the second part of the test and the third part of the test. And this is really, really important for understanding that the parts that were similar but were not copying because they were not substantial, these are things that should be freely available for everyone to use. We call these the ideas in copyright as opposed to the individual expression of the idea. Remember from the musicology report, the things that Sami Switch's team was saying are similar in the Ed Sheeran case, such as the rhythmic clicking and the lyrics O Y and O I. The court said this is not original enough. You can't have copyright protection over the O I, O Y, because that means that no other songs would be able to do that. Copyright is all about balancing. We want to give rights to creators so that they can control their work and make money from their work and decide what happens to it and earn royalties and sell their catalogue, do all of these amazing things. But we also need to make sure that we don't over protect so that other people can't also create amazing things. There's this really ongoing, constant balancing act between what's protected and what's not protected. And sometimes that's just as important to be like, There's only 12 notes to choose from. You're limited in your choices. We need to make sure that you can go and create a song and not be worried about using a basic chord progression that's in so many pop songs, so that has to be not protected by copyright. And the plot twist, which I said to remember from earlier about the similar fact evidence, was that when the judge analysed the No Scrubs claim against the same song, Shape of You, the court actually said, this is not copyright infringement either. Why are you paying that money to them? And Ed got the rights back and the royalties back for the whole song, Shape of You, which I'm sure after all of that stressful, expensive court case was a mere consolation prize. You can see Ed Sheeran talk about this in interviews where he said that he now records all of his songwriting processes so that he has it there all on record. And during one of the other cases, he had said if he didn't win this case, he was actually going to quit songwriting because it was so stressful and it was going to ruin it for him, where it's like, you can't just sit down and create. You've got to be worried about what's protected and what's not. And I really, really understand that. And that's why it's so important for copyright to maintain that clear, appropriate balance where we do protect people's songs, but we also allow creative freedom. So remember, just because two songs sound the same doesn't mean one was copied. Okay, so that's it for today. Thanks for listening. Follow Whose Song Is It Anyway on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Amazon Music, or wherever you get your podcasts for more. And I'll keep on breaking it all down for you. In the meantime, you can grab a copy of my book, Copyright in the Music Industry, your go-to practical guide for navigating copyright and IP with clarity and confidence. I've linked to it in the show notes for you. See you in the next episode.